I woke up to the steady beep of a hospital monitor, my body completely paralyzed, and my eyelids heavy as lead. I was about to force my eyes open when I heard the man I was supposed to marry whisper something that made my blood run cold. He said the mechanic promised the brakes would give out completely on the highway and that I was not supposed to survive. Then my own mother replied, "Stop whining and just press her thumb to the phone screen so we can drain her crypto wallet before she wakes up." I stayed perfectly still, breathing softly, listening to them plot my demise. My name is Cassidy, 27 years old, and somehow still alive to tell you how I destroyed the people who tried to bury me. I work as an independent forensic accountant, which means I track hidden money for a living. They picked the absolute worst person to steal from. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Lying there in that sterile hospital room, I felt the cold plastic of the intravenous tube taped to the back of my hand. My mind was racing, but my muscles simply refused to obey my commands. Derek paced the floor at the foot of my bed. I could hear his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. Those were the exact shoes I bought him for our anniversary last month. He groaned out loud, complaining to my mother that the car accident he orchestrated was supposed to be a clean and quick kill. He paced faster, whining that he could not handle the stress of waiting for me to flatline and that the doctors were taking too long to declare me brain dead. My mother Brenda scoffed at his weakness. Her voice lacked even a single ounce of maternal warmth or grief. She told him to pull himself together and act like a man. She explicitly stated that they needed the $4 million stored in my digital wallet by midnight, or else my younger sister Maddie would lose the lease on her ridiculous tech startup office downtown. Brenda snapped at him, her tone venomous and sharp. She told him that I had already paid off her entire house mortgage last year, so now it was finally my turn to sacrifice for my younger sister. She actually looked Derek in the face and told him to stop complaining, reminding him that I worked 3 grueling shifts a day just to pay off his massive college tuition debts. Hearing her say that out loud made my stomach churn with pure disgust. For years, I genuinely believed I was helping the people I loved. Instead, I was just funding a parasite and feeding a monster. My own mother viewed my entire life as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be emptied. Maddie had always been the golden child, and I was just the workhorse meant to fund her glamorous lifestyle. I heard Derek step closer to the side of my bed. His cheap cologne filled my nostrils, making me want to gag. He grabbed my right hand. His grip was rough, cold, and incredibly impatient. He muttered curses under his breath, trying to forcefully position my thumb over the biometric sensor of my smartphone. Pure sheer panic set in. I could not control my autonomic nervous system at all. The heart rate monitor next to my bed started beeping faster and faster, betraying my returning consciousness. The alarm blared loudly. Derek froze in his tracks. He told my mother to look at the screen, panicking that I was waking up and ruining their perfect plan. He gripped my thumb much harder, twisting my wrist, desperate to unlock the phone before I could open my eyes or scream for help. Just as he pressed my skin against the glass screen, the heavy hospital door flew open and slammed violently against the wall. A deep, authoritative voice shattered the dark tension in the room. It was Terrence. He is 32 years old, an imposing African-American man with a razor-sharp mind and a top-tier corporate lawyer. He also happens to be my sister Maddie's husband, though I secretly knew their toxic marriage was rapidly falling apart. Terrence marched right up to Derek and slapped his hand away from mine with enough force to make Derek stumble backward into the medical cart. Terrence looked Derek dead in the eye and told him that federal law in Illinois considers forcing biometric data from an incapacitated patient a felony offense. He asked Derek if he was eager to spend the next 10 years rotting in a federal penitentiary. Derek stammered uncontrollably, making up a pathetic excuse about just holding my hand because he was so overwhelmingly worried about his beautiful fiancée. My mother immediately jumped in to defend Derek, pointing her finger at Terrence and telling him he had absolutely no right to burst in and threaten family members during a medical crisis. Terrence did not back down for a single second. He told Brenda that considering she was actively trying to rob her comatose daughter, the word family did not mean much in this room. He warned them both that he was fully prepared to call the hospital security team and the local police if they did not step away from my bed immediately. I heard Derek shuffle backward, cowardly, retreating toward the doorway with my mother trailing closely behind him. She muttered vile curses under her breath, promising Terence that he would deeply regret interfering with their private family business. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving just Terence and me in the quiet, tense room. I slowly fluttered my eyelids open, the bright fluorescent lights blinding me for a brief second. When my vision finally cleared, I looked up and made direct eye contact with Terence. He did not look surprised at all. He stepped closer to the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. He leaned down over me, pretending to adjust my hospital pillows for the nurses. As he lifted the fabric, I felt him slip something small, cold, and hard right under my neck. It was a micro recorder. He whispered very softly, his voice barely a breath. He told me that he knew I was awake and that they were coming for absolutely everything I owned. He told me to keep my eyes closed and let them think I was completely broken. In that exact moment, staring up at the ugly ceiling tiles, I made the most important and dangerous decision of my entire life. I was going to fake severe retrograde amnesia. I would let them think my mind was completely gone and that I was helpless. I would let them get close, let them get comfortable, and let them confess to all their crimes on tape. They wanted to treat me like a bank, so I was going to give them an audit from hell. I let out a convincing, painful groan and blinked rapidly, staring blankly at the hospital ceiling. Derek immediately scrambled to his feet, pretending to wipe away a non-existent tear. My mother rushed to the other side of the bed, her face stretched into a mask of exaggerated concern. My younger sister Maddie pushed past her, wearing a designer sweater paid for with my credit card. I looked at them with wide, terrified eyes. I asked them where I was and why my chest hurt so much. I made my voice shake. I looked at Derek as if he were a complete stranger. I asked him who he was and why he was in my hospital room. The panic on his face was entirely genuine this time. He looked at my mother, completely lost. I told them the last thing I remembered was studying for my high school finals. I told them I was supposed to graduate next week, and I needed to finish my calculus homework. Brenda's eyes lit up with a sick kind of opportunistic joy. She quickly masked it with a fake sob. She grabbed my hand and stroked my hair, playing the role of a devastated but loving mother perfectly. She told me I was 27 years old and that I had been in a terrible accident. Maddie chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me a blatant, disgusting lie. She said I had been struggling with alcohol lately. She claimed I got behind the wheel completely intoxicated and crashed my car into a concrete divider on the highway. Maddie pointed at Derek and called him my absolute hero. She said Derek was driving behind me, pulled me from the burning wreckage, and saved my life just before the car exploded. I felt a surge of pure bile rise in my throat. Derek, the man who paid a mechanic to sever my brake lines, was now being painted as my knight in shining armor. I forced myself to cry, hiding my face in my hands, playing the role of a traumatized, confused teenager. I sobbed loudly, apologizing over and over for being reckless, while internally cataloging every single lie they fed me. This was psychological warfare, and they were handing me all the ammunition I needed. A few hours later, the doctor came in to check my vitals. Brenda immediately pulled him aside, loudly whispering that I was severely confused and emotionally unstable. She was already laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent. After the doctor left, my smartphone buzzed loudly on the bedside table. It was an automated alert from one of my secure offshore accounts. Brenda lunged for the phone like a starving animal. She told me I needed complete mental rest and that looking at screens would only damage my fragile brain. She reached out to slip the device into her expensive leather purse. I snapped my hand forward and snatched the phone right out of her grip. My reaction was too fast, too sharp for someone supposedly suffering from severe brain trauma. Brenda looked startled, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. I quickly softened my expression and used my forensic accounting instincts to formulate a bulletproof excuse. I told her the phone was hard-coded to a decentralized banking security protocol I remembered setting up for my high school savings account. I babbled rapidly about two-factor authentication, biometric rolling codes, and automatic asset freezes if the device remained disconnected from its primary user for more than 12 hours. I told her if the phone powered down or left my physical proximity, my entire bank account would automatically lock and undergo a 60-day fraud investigation. The sheer terror of losing access to my money made Brenda freeze instantly. She slowly pulled her hand back, visibly frustrated. She forced a tight smile and told me to just keep it turned off and resting on the table. She had no idea I was actually monitoring a silent security alert from my home network. Someone was trying to breach my firewall. 2 days later, they discharged me. Derek insisted on driving me back to the house. My house. The one I bought with my own money, though Brenda always told everyone it was a family investment. The drive was excruciating. Derek kept reaching over to hold my hand, calling me baby, acting like a devoted partner. I had to force myself not to pull away in sheer disgust. I kept up the amnesia act, staring out the passenger window, asking naive questions about the neighborhood, to maintain the illusion that I had lost 9 years of my life. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Brenda and Maddie were already there. They were waiting on the front porch with a ridiculously fake welcome home banner. They ushered me inside, acting like a team of devoted nurses. They flitted around the kitchen preparing herbal tea and talking to me in condescending voices as if I were a toddler. The entire atmosphere felt incredibly suffocating. They were treating my house like it was already their property. I told them I felt dizzy from the medication and needed to lie down in my bedroom. Derek eagerly offers to carry me up the stairs, but I firmly declined, saying the doctor wanted me to walk to rebuild my muscle strength. I slowly made my way down the second-floor hallway, dragging my feet to sell the severe injury. As I approached my bedroom, I glanced toward the end of the hall. My secure home office was located right next to the guest bathroom. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy, solid oak door was splintered near the metal frame. Deep gouge marks surrounded the deadbolt. Someone had taken a heavy crowbar to it. I pushed the broken door open, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was completely trashed. My filing cabinets were pried open, and documents were scattered everywhere. My dual monitors were pushed aside and left dangling off the desk. The hardwood floorboards near my desk were heavily scratched. But what made my blood run completely cold was the state of my wall safe hidden behind a framed diploma. The electronic keypad had been smashed with a hammer, and the metal dial was bent completely out of shape. Someone had been frantically, desperately searching for my physical crypto keys. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, staring at the ruined metal of my wall safe. Footsteps echoed heavily on the hardwood floor behind me. Derek walked into the office, kicking a pile of my scattered tax documents out of his way with a frustrated sigh. He closed the splintered door behind him and leaned against it, blocking my only exit. The loving fiancé act vanished instantly. His eyes were cold, calculating, and incredibly impatient. He pointed at the battered safe and demanded the combination. He told me I needed to stop playing games and open it right now because all of our joint wedding funds were locked inside. I knew for an absolute fact that he had never contributed a single cent to my savings, let alone any wedding funds. Our joint account had exactly $0 in it because he spent his entire paycheck on luxury watches and expensive golf trips. I forced my hands to tremble, backing away from him until my hips hit the edge of my ruined desk. I looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, begging him to explain what he meant. I told him I barely remembered who he was, let alone a complex string of numbers for a safe I did not even recognize. My fake confusion only infuriated him more. He pushed himself off the door and closed the distance between us in 2 large strides. Before I could even flinch or step away, he reached out and grabbed both of my shoulders with a punishing, aggressive grip. His fingers dug deeply into my skin, right over the dark bruises I had sustained in the car crash he caused. He shook me hard, his fingers pressing painfully into my collarbone. He leaned his face inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee and anxiety. He growled at me to think harder. He said his patience was completely gone. and that he was not going to play babysitter to a brain-damaged teenager, while his money was sitting just out of reach behind an inch of reinforced steel. I whimpered loudly, squeezing my eyes shut, acting completely terrified of his sudden outburst. Internally, my mind was racing with absolute clarity. I was memorizing the exact amount of pressure he was applying, filing away this physical assault for the police report I would eventually file when the time was right. The office door suddenly pushed open, scraping loudly against the scratched floorboards. My mother walked in holding a steaming porcelain mug of herbal tea. She stopped and looked directly at Derek, whose hands were still clamped aggressively around my bruised shoulders. She saw the sheer terror on my face. She saw him physically hurting me, and she did absolutely nothing. She did not yell at him to let go. She did not rush to protect her injured daughter. Instead, she let out a long, irritated sigh and took a slow sip of her tea. She looked at me with an expression of pure annoyance, as if my assault was just an inconvenience to her afternoon. She told Derek to let me go before he gave me another concussion, but her tone was incredibly casual, as if he were merely squeezing a piece of fruit too hard at the grocery store. Derek released me, taking a step back and running a trembling hand through his hair in frustration. Brenda stepped over the scattered financial papers and stood right in front of me. She told me to stop being so incredibly selfish and dramatic. She said the doctors told her that memory loss could be overcome if the patient simply tried hard enough. She crossed her arms and glared at me, complaining that the bank was already threatening to freeze her platinum credit cards because the automatic payments from my accounts had bounced that morning. She demanded that I sit in this ruined room all night if I had to, just staring at the wall safe until the numbers magically came back to me. She told me that family requires sacrifice, that I owed them for taking care of me, and that my stubborn refusal to remember was ruining her financial stability. She then turned around, patted Derek affectionately on the arm, and told him to come downstairs for a hot dinner, leaving me alone in the dark wreckage of my own office. I waited until the house was completely silent. Around 2 in the morning, I slipped out of bed, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboard near the door. I locked my bedroom door as quietly as possible. I knelt on the rug near my closet and pulled back the edge of the thick carpet. Using a metal nail file, I pried up a loose piece of wood I had specially modified 2 years ago. Taped to the underside of the floorboard was a waterproof bag containing a fully charged backup tablet, untraceable, and disconnected from the main compromised network. I powered it on, keeping the screen brightness turned down to a barely visible glow. I bypassed the standard local network and connected directly to my hidden secondary router, accessing the logs of my smart home. They thought they were so clever, smashing the physical router in my office, completely unaware that a forensic accountant always keeps a mirrored cloud backup of every single byte of data. I pulled up the internal network activity logs. My heart hammered in my chest as I decrypted the internet search history from Maddie and Derek's devices, which were carelessly connected to my guest network. The data I saw made my blood run entirely cold. But the search history was not the worst part. I accessed the hidden nanny camera I had installed inside the smoke detector of my own bedroom months ago, originally meant to keep an eye on a dishonest house cleaner. I downloaded the video files from the past month. I sat there in the dark, watching crystal clear footage of Derek and my sister Maddie rolling around in my own bed, tangled in my expensive silk sheets. They had been sleeping together for months. They were laughing, drinking my expensive wine, and mocking my demanding work schedule while I was away on business trips. The betrayal cut so deep it physically knocked the breath out of my lungs. I forced myself to keep watching, to keep digging through their digital footprints. I switched back to the search logs. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, while I was still lying paralyzed in a hospital bed fighting for my life, Maddie had used my home network to download several legal templates. I opened the downloaded file names. They were applying for a medical proxy. They were downloading state-specific forms for a conservatorship. They were actively building a legal case to declare me completely mentally incompetent, permanently stripping away my human rights so they could take total control of my assets without ever needing my passwords. They did not just want to steal my money, they wanted to erase my independence entirely. I set the tablet down on the carpet, the blue light illuminating my cold, furious smile. They wanted a legal war over my estate. I was going to give them an absolute massacre. I packed the tablet away and slid the floorboard back into place, just as the sun began to rise. A few hours later, Brenda unlocked my bedroom door. She was not alone. Behind her stood a tall, severely dressed man holding a leather briefcase. Brenda introduced him as Dr. Wallace, a private psychiatrist she claimed was hired by the hospital to evaluate my recovery. I knew instantly he was a paid hack. His suit was too expensive, his watch was too flashy, and he did not even bother to check my vitals or ask about my physical pain. He sat in the chair next to my bed and began asking highly leading questions. He asked if I felt overwhelmed by my complex financial portfolio. He asked if I frequently forgot basic daily tasks. He asked if I felt I needed someone to manage my adult responsibilities until my injured brain completely healed. I played the part perfectly. I stared at him with empty eyes, trembling my hands, and gave him the exact answers Brenda wanted to hear. I told him I felt lost, confused, and terrified of making any decisions. I pretended I did not even know what a mutual fund was. Dr. Wallace smiled a greasy, condescending smile. He pulled out a thick stack of evaluation forms and began checking boxes with a silver pen. He was officially creating the paper trail for my post-traumatic cognitive decline. They were building the medical foundation to strip away my legal autonomy. Derek stood in the doorway watching the entire exchange with a hungry, predatory gleam in his eyes. I watched Dr. Wallace scribble furiously on his notepad. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I purposely messed up on the third number, acting frustrated and breaking down into fake tears. Brenda rushed to my side not to comfort me, but to look over the doctor's shoulder at his notes. She asked him directly if my condition warranted a medical proxy. Dr. Wallace nodded gravely. He stated that in his professional medical opinion, my cognitive decline was severe and likely permanent. He said I was entirely incapable of managing my own assets or making sound medical decisions. He promised to have the official evaluation typed up and signed by the end of the day. Derek practically vibrated with excitement. He thanked the doctor profusely, already imagining how he would spend my life savings once the judge signed the guardianship order. I kept my face buried in my hands, crying softly, while my mind meticulously planned how to ruin Dr. Wallace and his corrupt medical license. The heavy atmosphere in the house was suddenly shattered by the sound of the front doorbell ringing continuously. Derek groaned, telling Brenda he would get rid of whoever was bothering them. A moment later, I heard loud, confident footsteps striding into the downstairs foyer. Derek's voice echoed up the stairs nervously, telling the visitor that this was not a good time. I recognized the deep, commanding voice immediately. It was Terrence. I slowly got out of bed, leaning heavily on the wall, and made my way out to the second-floor landing. I looked down at the entryway. Terrence was standing there in a sharp, tailored navy suit. He completely ignored Derek and looked straight up at Brenda, who had just stepped out of my room. He announced that he was just stopping by to pick up a few boxes of his winter clothes that he had left in the guest bedroom. I knew the truth. He was quietly preparing to serve my sister with divorce papers and wanted his personal belongings secured before the legal bloodbath began. Brenda walked halfway down the stairs, her face twisting into a mask of polite hostility. She looked at Terrence, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She told him that Maddie was not home and that it was incredibly inappropriate for him to barge into their family crisis uninvited. She put heavy emphasis on the word family. She looked Terrence up and down, her eyes dripping with racial microaggressions and elitist disdain. She smiled a tight, condescending smile and told him that he really did not understand their family dynamics. She said that traditional families like ours handled traumatic medical situations differently, and that he should probably just wait outside until Maddie returned to deal with him. Terrence did not even blink. He calmly adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked Brenda directly in the eyes. The air in the foyer turned ice cold. He told her that he understood their family dynamics perfectly. He said he understood that her family dynamic consisted of a mother who was deeply in debt, a golden child sister who was currently unemployed, and a parasitic fiancé who could not even afford the lease payments on his own car. Terrence took a massive step forward, towering over Derek, who immediately shrank back against the wall. Terrence stated with absolute legal precision that until a judge signed a legal decree stripping me of my rights, this house still solely belonged to me. He reminded Brenda that she was technically a transient guest in my home, and under Illinois state property laws she had absolutely no legal authority to deny him entry or ask him to leave. Brenda turned bright red, her mouth opening and closing in shock. She tried to stammer out a defense, but Terrence cut her off effortlessly. He informed her that he was a senior partner at a major corporate law firm, and if she wanted to test his understanding of the law, he would be more than happy to bury her in so much litigation she would not even be able to afford her morning coffee. He stared her down until she physically stepped aside, completely defeated by his sheer presence and intellect. Terrence walked up the stairs, his heavy leather briefcase swinging at his side. As he passed me on the landing, his stern expression softened for a fraction of a second. He carried a brown paper takeout bag from my favorite Thai restaurant in his left hand. He stopped right in front of me, playing the role of a concerned brother-in-law perfectly. He told me he brought me some hot food because hospital food was terrible, and he wanted to make sure I was actually eating. He handed the bag to me. The paper was warm, but I immediately felt the distinct heavy weight of a solid rectangular object resting at the very bottom, hidden beneath the plastic containers of noodles. Derek rushed up the stairs behind him, trying to snatch the bag away, claiming I was on a strict medical diet. Terrence smoothly blocked Derek with his broad shoulder, forcing him back a step. Terrence told Derek to back off and let me eat my lunch in peace, or he would personally throw him through the front window. Derek swallowed hard and backed away, completely intimidated. Terrence walked into the guest room, grabbed 2 small boxes he had packed previously, and walked right back out. He did not say another word to Brenda or Derek. He simply walked down the stairs and out the front door, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. I took the takeout bag and slowly shuffled back into my bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed and pushed the containers of food aside. Sitting at the bottom of the bag was a brand new, fully charged burner phone. Taped to the back of the phone was a small, neatly folded piece of white paper. I unfolded it carefully. Terrence had written a short, sharp message in his elegant handwriting. It read, "They are filing for emergency guardianship tomorrow morning. Let us hunt." I read the note from Terrence and a cold smile spread across my face. The hunt was officially on. I grabbed the burner phone and immediately got to work. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I used the secure device to bypass the compromised local network and log directly into my offshore banking portals. As a forensic accountant, my entire career is built on understanding how money moves, how it hides, and exactly how greedy people try to steal it. I knew that Derek and my mother were desperate for a quick, massive payout. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, wrapped in a digital bomb. I initiated a highly complex series of wire transfers. I took exactly $4 million from my primary investment portfolio and moved it into a temporary, isolated decoy account. I then dug into the bottom drawer of my nightstand and found an old, cheap promotional USB drive I had gotten at a financial conference years ago. I plugged it into my hidden tablet and wiped it completely clean. I spent the next 2 hours writing a custom script and building a fake user interface. When plugged into any computer, the USB drive would automatically launch a dashboard that looked exactly like a high-end cryptocurrency cold wallet. It prominently displayed a staggering balance of $4 million. But it was nothing more than a honeypot. It was a lethal digital trap designed to lure them in and trigger a massive financial lockdown the moment they tried to transfer the funds. I carefully unfastened the backing of my bedroom vanity mirror and taped the USB drive right behind the glass. The bait was set. Now I just needed to make sure the rats smelled the cheese. Later that afternoon, I slowly made my way downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Maddie was sitting at the marble island, casually flipping through a luxury real estate magazine. She looked up and gave me a sickeningly sweet smile that did not reach her eyes. She asked me how my little brain was holding up today. I kept my posture slumped and my hands shaking, pouring a glass of water with exaggerated clumsiness. I spilled a little on the counter and apologized profusely, playing the role of the broken, confused sister perfectly. Maddie laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the large kitchen. She told me not to worry about making a mess, because soon she would be hiring a full-time housekeeping staff to manage the property. She casually mentioned that once the judge signed the guardianship papers tomorrow morning, she and my mother were going to do some major renovations. She looked around my beautiful kitchen and sneered, saying my taste in decor was horribly outdated and that the house needed a younger, more vibrant touch. I forced tears into my eyes and my voice to tremble. I told her this was my house and she had no right to change anything. Maddie rolled her eyes and slammed the magazine shut. She walked over to me, invading my personal space, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She told me I did not have a house anymore. She said I barely had a functioning brain. She leaned in close and whispered that I was legally going to become a child tomorrow, and that every single cent I had ever earned was going to belong to her. She mocked my intelligence, telling me that for a supposed financial genius, I was incredibly stupid to leave my assets so unprotected. I took a step back, breathing heavily, acting completely panicked and cornered. I let out a desperate defensive cry. I told her she was completely wrong. I yelled that she and Derek would never get their hands on my real money because it was locked away safely. Maddie raised an eyebrow, her predatory instincts instantly kicking in. She crossed her arms and challenged me, laughing directly in my face. She told me the bank had already frozen my checking accounts, and that there was no secret vault waiting to save me. I shook my head wildly, acting like a terrified, cornered animal lashing out blindly. I blurted out that I did not need the bank. I screamed that my entire life savings, $4 million, was sitting on an untraceable encrypted flash drive. Maddie froze. Her eyes widened with sudden intense greed. She took a step forward and demanded to know where it was. I slapped my hands over my mouth, my eyes wide with manufactured terror, acting exactly like someone who had just made a catastrophic mistake. I started backing away toward the stairs, shaking my head violently. Maddie grabbed my arm forcefully. She dug her manicured nails into my skin and screamed at me to tell her where the drive was. I ripped my arm away and sobbed loudly. I yelled that she would never find it, that it was hidden perfectly behind the glass of my vanity mirror upstairs, and that she would never figure out the password. As soon as the words left my mouth, I let out a horrified gasp, turned around, and practically crawled up the stairs as fast as I could, sobbing the entire way. I ran into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it loudly. I collapsed onto the floor, buried my face in my hands, and smiled a wide, genuine smile. I waited for the sun to go down. The house grew incredibly quiet. I crawled under my heavy comforter and pulled the hidden tablet close to my chest. I opened the live feed from the nanny camera hidden inside my smoke detector. The night vision lens cast a green glow over the screen. Around midnight, the handle of my bedroom door slowly clicked. Derek had clearly picked the lock. The door creaked open just an inch. He slipped into my bedroom, moving with the practiced silence of a thief. He did not even glance at the bed where I was pretending to be deeply asleep. He crept straight across the room toward the vanity mirror. I watched the screen intensely as he pulled a small pocket knife from his jeans and carefully pried the wooden backing away from the glass. His hand reached into the dark crevice. A second later, he pulled out the cheap plastic USB drive. Even in the grainy night vision footage, I could see his chest heaving with excitement. He quickly pulled his smartphone from his pocket. The bright glare of his screen illuminated his greedy, grinning face. I zoomed in on the camera feed just in time to read the text message he was typing. He sent it directly to Maddie. It read, "Got it. We are rich." I watched the text message. Got it, we are rich. Illuminate the dark screen of my tablet. Derek slipped out of my bedroom as silently as he had entered, pulling the door shut until the lock clicked back into place. I threw off my heavy comforter and sat cross-legged on the mattress, my eyes glued to the network monitoring software. I knew exactly where he was going. 2 rooms down the hallway, Maddie was waiting in her bedroom with her high-end laptop already booted up. I held my breath watching the blinking cursor on my custom dashboard. 10 seconds passed, then 20. I could almost picture them sitting side by side on the edge of Maddie's bed, practically salivating over a small piece of plastic. Suddenly, my tablet screen flashed bright green. A command prompt window opened automatically, lines of code scrolling down the screen faster than the human eye could read. He had plugged it in. The moment the USB connected to Maddie's laptop, it executed a silent, invisible payload. On their end, a beautiful, highly realistic cryptocurrency wallet interface popped up on the screen, prominently displaying a locked balance of $4 million and a fake progress bar indicating a decryption process. It was designed to keep them occupied and staring at the screen for exactly 45 minutes. On my end, the Trojan virus had just kicked down the front door to their entire digital existence. I cracked my knuckles and went straight to work. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to follow digital breadcrumbs, but this was not even a hunt. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet of their darkest secrets. The Trojan immediately established a secure backdoor connection, granting me unrestricted administrative access to every single file, application, and saved password on Maddie's machine. Because Derek had his smartphone synced to her computer for easy photo sharing, the virus effortlessly bridged the gap, infecting his device as well. Within 3 minutes, I had completely bypassed their pathetically weak security measures. I began mirroring their hard drives directly to my encrypted cloud server. I started with their finances. I opened Maddie's supposedly glamorous business accounts. Her tech startup was not just failing. It was a massive, bleeding financial crater. She was drowning in high-interest loans and had not paid her 2 employees in a month. I then cracked Derek's offshore accounts, which he always bragged were part of his complex investment portfolio. They were nothing but empty shell accounts set up purely to receive the stolen money they planned to siphon from me. They were completely broke, desperate, and relying entirely on my death or incapacitation to save them from total ruin. But I was not just looking for financial fraud. I wanted the absolute truth about the night my life almost ended. I navigated into their synchronized cloud storage drives, bypassing the active folders and digging straight into the system trash and deleted items directories. Criminals always think that dragging a file to the recycling bin and clicking empty completely erases their sins. They never realize that the data remains burned into the hard drive until it is overwritten by new information. Using a specialized data recovery tool, I loaded through the Trojan. I began pulling up files they thought were gone forever. My eyes scanned hundreds of recovered file names until one specific folder caught my attention. It was labeled simply with the date of my car crash. My pulse pounded in my ears as I commanded the software to restore the entire folder. Inside were several video files generated by a high-definition dashboard camera. It was the dash cam from Derek's car. I clicked on the first video file, my hands trembling slightly as the media player buffered and then started to play. The footage was stark and chilling. It was time-stamped at 2 a.m. the night before my accident. The camera angle showed the dark, empty parking garage beneath my downtown accounting firm, where I had been working a grueling late shift to finish a massive audit. Derek had parked his car in the shadows across from my assigned parking spot. The audio picked up his heavy breathing. I watched the screen in absolute horror as Derek stepped out of his vehicle and walked into the frame. He was wearing dark clothes and carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. He looked around nervously, checking for security guards before dropping to his knees and sliding completely underneath the front end of my sports car. He stayed under there for 6 agonizing minutes. I heard the distinct metallic clinking of a wrench and the sharp snap of wire cutters. He was not just loosening the brake lines. He was methodically severing the primary fluid lines, ensuring that the next time I drove on the highway, my brakes would fail completely and catastrophically. He slid back out, wiped his greasy hands on a rag, and smirked directly into the dashcam lens as he walked back to his car. It was cold, calculated, and undeniably premeditated. I was watching the literal blueprint of my own murder. A wave of profound icy rage washed over me. I paused the video and took a deep, steadying breath. I had the smoking gun to send him to prison for decades, but I knew my mother had to be involved. She was the one constantly pressuring him to speed up the process. I minimized the video player and opened the archived text message database from Derek's phone. I ran a keyword search for my name, filtering the results to the 48 hours leading up to the crash. Dozens of messages populated the screen, mostly Maddie complaining about my attitude. But then I saw a thread between Derek and Brenda. It was sent from her primary number, completely unencrypted and undeniably authentic. I clicked on the conversation thread. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second as I read the words glowing on my screen. Brenda had texted him at exactly 8 o'clock the night before he sabotaged my car. The message read, "Do it tomorrow. Her life insurance policy expires at midnight. Make it look like she was drinking." I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. Make it look like she was drinking. My own mother had not just approved of my murder, she had actively scheduled it to maximize her financial payout. Any lingering shred of familial loyalty I had left evaporated entirely in that exact moment. I could have easily picked up my burner phone right then and called the local police department. Handing over the dashcam footage and the text messages would have guaranteed their immediate arrest, but a quiet, dignified arrest in the middle of the night was far too good for them. I did not just want to send them to prison. I wanted to completely obliterate their social standing, strip away every ounce of their fake prestige, and humiliate them in front of the entire high society circle they cared so deeply about. I wanted a nuclear public execution. The perfect opportunity presented itself the very next morning. I woke up to the sound of heavy trucks backing into my driveway and the loud chatter of workers. I peeked through my bedroom window blinds and saw a massive white event tent being erected on my back lawn. Caterers were carrying trays of expensive crystal glasses and arranging lavish floral centerpieces on dozens of round tables. Brenda had spent the last week organizing an exclusive high-ticket charity brunch. She invited over 100 of her wealthiest country club friends, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. The official cause for the event was to raise money for my traumatic brain injury recovery fund. In reality, it was a shameless, sickening cash grab. She had set up a fake charity foundation under her own name, fully intending to pocket every single donation to pay off her mounting credit card debts. I could even see large, glossy posters strategically placed around the patio, featuring a blown-up photograph of me from my college graduation, completely overlaid with bold text begging for financial support to cover my supposed permanent medical care. The sheer audacity of using my face to steal money from local philanthropists made my blood boil. I watched Maddie and Brenda barking orders at the catering staff, acting like wealthy aristocrats generously opening their estate for a noble cause. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their digital world had been entirely captured and mirrored onto my secure server. My burner phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened a secure encrypted messaging app. It was a message from Terrence. He had been working relentlessly behind the scenes all morning, coordinating with his contacts in federal law enforcement. His text was short, professional, and incredibly satisfying. It read, "I have the FBI Financial Crimes Unit on standby. They have reviewed the wire fraud evidence from your honeypot drive and the dashcam footage. Give me the signal when you are ready to drop the hammer." I typed out a quick response. I told him to trace the license plates of the expensive cars parked out front, ensuring nobody could leave before the federal agents locked down the perimeter. Then I replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. I locked the phone and walked over to my bedroom closet. For the past few days, Brenda and Maddie had forced me to wear baggy, frumpy sweatpants and oversized t-shirts to sell the image of a helpless, brain-damaged invalid. I reached to the very back of my closet and pulled off the plastic cover from my most expensive tailored designer dress. It was a striking, powerful emerald green sheath dress that fit me perfectly. I took a long, hot shower, washing away days of fake weakness and the lingering scent of hospital antiseptic. I plugged in my curling iron and styled my hair in sleek, professional waves. I applied my makeup flawlessly, choosing a bold, sharp red lipstick that screamed absolute confidence. I slipped on a pair of high-heeled stilettos that I had supposedly forgotten how to walk in. I grabbed my designer handbag, dropping my burner phone and a small wireless Bluetooth speaker inside. I stood in front of my full-length mirror and looked at my reflection. The terrified amnesiac girl from the hospital was completely gone. The forensic accountant was back, fully armored and ready for war. I took a deep breath, savoring the adrenaline coursing through my veins. It was finally time to stop faking the limp. It was time to stop trembling. It was time to end this pathetic charade once and for all. I unlocked my bedroom door and stepped out onto the second-floor landing. The house was empty, as everyone was already outside enjoying the catering. I walked down the grand staircase, my stilettos clicking sharply against the hardwood steps, with a steady, rhythmic authority. I did not hold on to the handrail. I did not hesitate. I walked straight through the kitchen and pushed open the heavy glass French doors leading out to the patio. The bright afternoon sunlight hit my face as I stepped out into my own backyard. Over 100 of Brenda's wealthy, pretentious friends were mingling under the massive white tent, sipping expensive champagne and eating caviar. A string quartet was playing soft classical music in the far corner, adding a sickening layer of elegance to this criminal gathering. I spotted Derek near the portable bar, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, laughing loudly with a group of local businessmen while holding a crystal glass of scotch. He was playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken fiancé to absolute perfection. I stood at the top of the stone patio steps, looking down at the sea of designer suits and expensive dresses. I was the main event, the tragic victim they had all paid $500 a plate to pity. For a few seconds, nobody noticed me standing there. Then a woman in a wide-brimmed hat turned around and dropped her champagne glass. It shattered loudly against the paving stones. The sharp noise caused a massive ripple effect. One by one, heads turned in my direction. The lively chatter died down almost instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The string quartet slowly stopped playing, the musicians lowering their bows in sheer confusion, and I was about to give them a show they would never forget. I descended the stone steps slowly, deliberately, letting my stilettos announce my arrival with sharp, authoritative clicks against the pavement. The lively chatter in my backyard died down almost instantly. It was replaced by a deafening, heavy silence. Every single pair of eyes in that massive white tent was locked directly on me. Brenda was standing near the temporary center stage they had constructed right next to my rose garden. Her jaw practically hit the freshly manicured grass. She had spent the entire morning feeding these wealthy socialites a pathetic sob story about her 27-year-old daughter being permanently confined to a dark bedroom, claiming I was barely able to string a coherent sentence together, let alone walk unassisted in high heels. For a split second, I saw genuine, unadulterated panic flash across her face. But my mother is nothing if not a professional manipulator. She instantly morphed her expression of absolute terror into one of overwhelming, tearful joy. She pushed her way through the crowd of stunned guests, holding her arms outstretched, playing the role of the devoted caregiver, witnessing a sudden, miraculous medical recovery. She threw her arms around my shoulders, hugging me so tightly that her acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin. She pulled me close and whispered harshly into my ear, her voice dripping with venom. She asked what on earth I was doing out of bed and demanded that I stop this embarrassing stunt right now. I did not hug her back. I simply stood completely still, letting her perform for her wealthy audience. Brenda pulled away, wiping a perfectly timed fake tear from her cheek, and grabbed a microphone from the nearby podium. She turned to the crowd of country club elites, local politicians, and business owners, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She told them this was exactly why they were gathered here today. She claimed my sudden appearance was a manic episode, a tragic symptom of my severe brain trauma causing me to act out and dress up in a highly confused state. Brenda gave a tearful, incredibly manipulative speech about the agonizing burden of caring for a mentally incapacitated daughter. She described her fake sleepless nights, the grueling medical appointments, and the heavy emotional toll of watching her brilliant child lose her entire mind. She painted herself as a saint, sacrificing her golden years to protect me from myself. She practically begged the crowd to open their checkbooks and donate to my recovery fund, successfully spinning my confident entrance as a heartbreaking display of severe mental illness. The crowd absolutely ate it up. I saw wealthy women dabbing their eyes with linen napkins and men nodding in solemn sympathy. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were funding her credit card bills. That is exactly when Derek decided it was time for his grand, heroic gesture. He handed his crystal glass of scotch to a passing caterer, adjusted his expensive tailored suit jacket, and walked purposefully toward the center stage to join Brenda and me. He took the microphone from my mother, gazing at me with a sickeningly sweet expression of fake devotion. He spoke directly to the crowd, his voice thick with fake emotion. He told them that the horrific car accident had tested our relationship, but that true love conquers all physical and mental obstacles. He talked about how he had promised to protect me forever, even if my mind was permanently broken, and I could never be the same woman he fell in love with. Then, right there in front of over 100 wealthy donors, Derek got down on one knee. The entire crowd gasped in collective delight. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket, but he did not pull out a velvet ring box. He did not have a diamond to offer me. Instead, he pulled out a thick, legally binding document attached to a heavy clipboard. He held it up for the crowd to see, loudly declaring that since we could not have the massive dream wedding we had originally planned, he wanted to secure our union legally, right here and right now. He called it a special emergency marriage license designed to protect my assets while I recovered. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my entire life analyzing legal contracts and spotting financial fraud from a mile away. It was not a marriage license. It was a comprehensive ironclad power of attorney agreement. I could easily read the bold text at the top of the page. The fine print explicitly granted Derek total, irrevocable control over my bank accounts, my real estate properties, my investment portfolios, and every single one of my medical decisions. He wanted me to sign my financial independence away, while 100 people cheered for our fake romance. Derek pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his pocket and offered it to me, holding the clipboard out like an eager puppy waiting for a treat. The psychological pressure in the tent was immense. The entire crowd started to clap rhythmically. Wealthy guests covered in expensive jewelry began chanting for me to sign the paper. They shouted their loud encouragement, telling me how incredibly lucky I was to have such a devoted, handsome man willing to care for a disabled wife. It was a textbook pack attack. The sheer weight of their collective expectation would have crushed anyone else into immediate submission. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were actively cheering for my absolute financial execution. My younger sister Maddie casually strolled up behind me, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She leaned closely over my right shoulder, her voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper that only I could hear over the loud cheering of the crowd. She told me to take the pen and sign the paper. She called me a brain-dead freak and warned me to stop embarrassing them before she dragged me back up the stairs to my room by my hair. She told me the game was completely over and that they had finally won. I slowly reached out and took the heavy silver fountain pen directly from Derek's hand. The crowd erupted into even louder cheers, clapping and whistling, genuinely believing they were witnessing a beautiful romantic milestone. Derek smiled broadly, his eyes gleaming with absolute, unrestrained greed. He held the clipboard steady, waiting eagerly for the ink to touch the paper and seal my fate. I looked down at the fraudulent power of attorney document. I looked at my mother, who was beaming with triumphant satisfaction. I looked over my shoulder at Maddie, whose arrogant smirk was permanently etched onto her face. Finally, I looked down at Derek, still kneeling on the grass like a pathetic beggar waiting for his payout. I did not sign my name. I flipped the heavy silver pen in my hand so the sharp metal nib pointed straight down. I raised my fist high in the air and drove the pen straight downward with every single ounce of strength I had, driving it completely through the thick stack of legal papers and pinning the fraudulent document directly to the wooden table beside us. The sharp thud of the metal pen piercing the solid oak table echoed through the microphone Derek had carelessly left resting on the podium. For a fraction of a second, nobody in the backyard moved a single muscle. The crowd of wealthy socialites simply stared in absolute shock, their manicured hands freezing mid-clap. The fake smiles instantly melted off the faces of my mother and sister, replaced by expressions of sheer horror. Derek looked down at the ruined power of attorney document, his mouth hanging completely open as he stared at the silver pen, vibrating slightly in the wood. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine confusion and sudden creeping terror. He reached out a trembling hand, whispering my name, still trying to maintain the facade of a caring partner who was just trying to help his sick fiancé. I took a deliberate, powerful step back, putting physical distance between myself and the man who tried to end my life. I stood perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back and lifting my chin high. The slumped posture, the vacant stare, the trembling hands, the confused teenager routine, I dropped every single piece of the pathetic amnesia act right there on the grass. The forensic accountant was fully in charge now. I looked him dead in the eyes, stepped around the ruined document, and grabbed the microphone right off the podium. My voice carried across the massive white tent, crystal clear, incredibly loud, and absolutely dripping with authority. I told him I would rather marry a rat living in the city sewers than legally bind myself to the man who deliberately cut my brake lines. A loud collective gasp erupted from the audience. Several wealthy women in designer dresses clapped their hands over their mouths in pure shock. The businessmen, who had just been cheering for our romantic engagement, now exchanged bewildered, alarmed glances. The silence that followed my declaration was so heavy and oppressive, it felt suffocating. You could hear the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the oak trees above the tent. Derek turned completely pale. The blood drained out of his face so fast he looked physically sick. He realized he was losing control of the narrative and he panicked. He started to stammer uncontrollably, taking a desperate step toward the crowd, with his hands raised in a placating defensive gesture. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. He grabbed the microphone stand and told the audience not to worry, claiming that this was exactly the kind of severe, psychotic episode the private doctors had warned them about. He tapped the side of his head with his index finger, looking at the crowd with fake, desperate sympathy. He stated loudly that my traumatic brain injury had caused massive paranoid delusions and that I did not know what I was saying. He turned back to me, adopting a sickeningly gentle, patronizing tone, telling me that I was very sick and that I needed to go back to my dark bedroom to rest before I hurt myself. He reached out to grab my upper arm fully, intending to forcefully drag me away from the audience before I could do any more damage to his massive financial payout. I slapped his hand away with so much physical force that the sharp crack of flesh against flesh echoed loudly through the entire tent. I looked at him with absolute disgust and told him not to ever touch me again. Maddie rushed forward, spilling her expensive champagne on the grass, her face flushed red with absolute fury. She hissed at me to shut my mouth and stop ruining her life in front of her future investors. Brenda was completely frozen in place, her eyes darting frantically between the ruined legal document on the table and the horrified faces of her wealthy friends desperately trying to calculate a way out of the catastrophic disaster I had just created in her own backyard. They thought my words were just the frantic, easily dismissed ravings of a disabled victim. They forgot I always come with receipts. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my secure burner phone. I had already used my tablet earlier that morning to discreetly sync this phone to the massive Bluetooth sound system the caterers had set up for the string quartet and the charity event announcements. I bypassed the DJ booth completely from my touchscreen. With one swift, decisive motion, I cranked the master volume on my phone, all the way up to its maximum capacity and pressed play on the audio file I had recovered from Derek's hidden cloud folder. The soft, elegant classical music stopped instantly. Instead, the heavy metallic sound of a steel wrench clanking violently against a car chassis blasted through the massive speakers surrounding the tent. The high-definition audio was unmistakable. The crowd listened in stunned, breathless silence as Derek's voice boomed across the pristine backyard. He was grunting with physical effort, cursing loudly about the tough metal casing of the brake fluid lines, and then laughing a cold, cruel, incredibly arrogant laugh as the heavy wire cutters snapped shut. But that was not the grand finale. I quickly swiped my screen to the next digital file. It was the recording of a phone call between Derek and my mother, intercepted and captured by the Trojan virus I had unleashed on their compromised devices the night before. Brenda's voice echoed through the expensive speakers, crystal clear and undeniable for her entire country club circle to hear. The recording played her exact damning words. She told Derek to stop whining like a child and just do the job tomorrow because my life insurance policy was set to expire at midnight. She explicitly ordered him to make the car crash look like I had been drinking heavily, so the insurance company would not launch a fraud investigation into the claim. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and absolutely explosive. The wealthy donors began physically backing away from the center stage in absolute disgust and terror. People were whispering frantically, pointing their fingers directly at my mother. The elegant facade of the charitable grieving family was entirely shattered, instantly replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of premeditated attempted murder. Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. Her perfectly crafted aristocratic persona vanished completely, revealing the desperate, vicious criminal hiding underneath. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer panic. She yelled to the crowd that the audio was completely faked and fabricated. She screamed that I was having a violent psychotic break and that I was a physical danger to everyone around me. She spun around and locked eyes with the two large, muscular private security guards she had hired to work the front entrance of the charity event. She frantically ordered them to step in and restrain me immediately. She screamed at them to tackle me to the ground, tie my hands behind my back, and call the local psychiatric asylum because her daughter had completely lost her mind. The two massive guards, confused by the sudden chaos, but blindly following the aggressive instructions of the wealthy woman paying their hourly rate, immediately abandoned their posts, lowered their shoulders, and began advancing rapidly toward me. The two massive security guards closed the distance between us in seconds. Their heavy boots pounded against the manicured lawn, their expressions hardened into grim determination. They fully believed my mother's hysterical lies. They thought they were subduing a dangerous, mentally unstable woman who had just ruined a beautiful charity event. The taller guard reached out with two massive hands, fully intending to grab my shoulders and force me down onto the grass. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked onto his, completely unfazed by his physical intimidation. My heart was pounding, but my mind was incredibly sharp. I knew I only had to stall for a few more seconds. Before the guard's thick fingers could even graze the fabric of my green designer dress, a deafening metallic crash echoed from the front of the property. The heavy wrought iron gates of my driveway were violently pushed open, hitting the brick pillars with a massive booming impact that shook the ground. The guards froze instantly, turning their heads toward the commotion. The entire crowd of wealthy socialites gasped again, their heads whipping around to see what new disaster was unfolding. Marching straight down the flagstone pathway toward the backyard tent was Terrence. He moved with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. He was wearing his sharp navy suit, his face set in an expression of absolute terrifying resolve. But he was not alone. Flanking him on his right and left were two federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with large yellow letters spelling FBI across their chests. Behind them, half a dozen fully uniformed Chicago police officers jogged onto the lawn, their hands resting securely on their utility belts. Terrence pointed a commanding finger directly at the two security guards standing inches away from me. His voice boomed across the yard, carrying more authority than a judge in a courtroom. He ordered them to step back immediately. He held up a thick stack of manila folders and legally stamped warrants, shouting that nobody touches his client. The private guards took one look at the federal windbreakers and the armed police officers immediately raising their hands in the air and backing away from me as fast as they could. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with federal law enforcement. Terrence strode right up to the center stage, positioning himself squarely between me and my panicked family. He looked like an impenetrable wall of legal defense. He handed the stack of warrants to the lead FBI agent, who immediately began coordinating with the local police officers to secure the perimeter of the backyard. Nobody was leaving this party. Terrence turned his attention to the crowd of stunned wealthy donors. The silence in the tent was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the grass. Terrence did not need a microphone to command the room. His voice was resonant, clear, and projected perfectly to the very back row of the tent. He looked directly at the local politicians and the country club elites who had just been clapping for my fake engagement. He addressed them clearly and professionally. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I strongly advise you to put your checkbooks away immediately. The charity you are donating to today is a registered shell company used exclusively for wire fraud." A collective wave of outrage and shock rippled through the audience. People began whispering frantically, clutching their designer purses, and glaring fiercely at my mother. Terrence did not stop there. He paced the edge of the stage, laying out the brutal, undeniable facts. He explained that Brenda had set up the fake foundation using a forged signature, directing every single incoming donation straight into an offshore holding account meant to pay off her massive personal credit card debts and fund a failing tech startup. He told the crowd that not a single penny of their generous contributions was ever going to be used for medical care, mostly because his client had never suffered any brain damage at all. Brenda's face turned an ugly mottled shade of purple. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as her entire carefully constructed aristocratic world burned to the ground in front of her eyes. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the warrants out of the FBI agent's hands. She screamed that Terrence was a liar and a bitter ex-husband trying to ruin her family. She demanded that the police arrest him for trespassing. The lead FBI agent smoothly stepped out of her reach, completely unbothered by her hysterical screaming. He looked down at Brenda with an expression of pure professional disgust. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and informed her that she was not giving any orders today. He stated clearly that she was officially under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back with practiced efficiency, and snapped the cold metal cuff onto her arm. Brenda let out a shrill, piercing shriek of pure disbelief. Maddie backed away from her mother, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She bumped into the wooden table, sending a tray of crystal champagne flutes crashing to the ground. She threw her hands up defensively, tears streaming down her face. She practically begged the officers, screaming that she had absolutely no idea what her mother was doing and that she was completely innocent. Terrence just looked at her with a cold, unforgiving stare, letting her know silently that her turn was coming very soon. While the crowd erupted into absolute chaos, demanding refunds and shouting at Brenda, Derek realized the complete gravity of the situation. The audio recording of his crime had been played for 100 witnesses. His offshore accounts were compromised. The federal agents had the dashcam footage of him cutting my brakes. He knew his life was entirely over. The fake charming fiancé persona evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cowardly criminal desperate to save his own skin. Derek locked eyes with a uniformed police officer stepping toward him. Without a single word of warning, Derek spun around and made a desperate wild sprint toward the tall wooden fence at the back of my property. He shoved a wealthy socialite out of his way, knocking her to the ground as he bolted across the grass. He never even made it halfway. A young, incredibly athletic Chicago police officer sprinted right past the center stage, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. The officer lunged forward, launching his entire body weight into the air. He tackled Derek square in the back with explosive force. The momentum sent both men flying violently forward, crashing headfirst into the massive, elegantly decorated catering table. Wooden planks snapped loudly under their combined weight. Expensive silver chafing dishes, glass bowls of caviar, and dozens of mimosas exploded into the air, raining food and shattered glass all over Derek's expensive tailored suit. He hit the ground groaning in agony, completely covered in ruined hors d'oeuvres, and immediately pinned beneath the heavy knee of the arresting officer. Derek let out a pathetic wail as the arresting officer forced his arms behind his back. The sharp snap of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed over the shattered glass and crushed wooden planks of the ruined catering table. He sobbed uncontrollably, his face pressed hard into the wet grass, begging the officer to let him go. The wealthy guests who had been cheering for him minutes ago were now recording his humiliating arrest from a safe distance. The federal agents instructed the local police to read him his Miranda rights on the lawn. Maddie stood frozen near the center stage, watching the destruction of her family. Her mother was in handcuffs. Her secret lover was bleeding on the ground. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her arrogant delusion. Panic overtook her. She whipped her head around frantically until her eyes locked onto Terrence. In her twisted mind, she still believed she could manipulate him. She thought her privilege and her status as his wife could somehow shield her from the consequences of her own actions. She hiked up her designer skirt and sprinted across the patio toward him. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup. She practically threw herself at Terrence, grabbing his tailored suit jacket with both hands. Her voice was shrill and completely hysterical. She yelled his name, calling him baby, pleading with him to do something. She grabbed his arm tightly, her acrylic nails digging into his sleeve. She begged him to step in, screaming that he was a brilliant corporate lawyer and had the power to make the police stop this massive misunderstanding. She cried that her mother and sister were just having a terrible miscommunication and that Terrence needed to protect their family. Terrence did not move a single muscle to comfort her. He did not offer a word of reassurance. Instead, he looked down at her hands, gripping his jacket with an expression of absolute disgust. He slowly and deliberately reached up, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her fingers off his suit. He took a calculated step back, creating a cold, impenetrable physical boundary between them. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He held it out toward her. Maddie stared at it, her hands trembling, refusing to take it. Terrence dropped the folder directly onto the grass at her feet. His voice was dangerously calm, carrying a lethal precision that cut through the chaotic backyard. He looked her dead in the eyes and stated clearly that he was indeed a lawyer. He told her the folder contained officially filed divorce papers. He stated he had already petitioned the court for an expedited dissolution of their marriage based on extreme marital misconduct. Maddie gasped, her face turning chalk white. She tried to stammer out an apology, but Terrence raised his hand to silence her. He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice just enough so only she and I could hear the absolute finality of his next words. He told her that he knew her tech startup was bankrupt and that she had been secretly siphoning funds from their joint marital accounts. He also knew she was desperately relying on a massive influx of capital from a group of conservative Christian angel investors to keep her company afloat. Terrence smiled a cold, ruthless smile. He casually informed her that an hour ago he had personally emailed those conservative Christian investors. He attached the complete financial audit, proving her company was a massive black hole of debt. More importantly, he attached the high-definition video files I had pulled from my hidden nanny camera. He told Maddie that her investors were currently watching crystal-clear footage of her sleeping with her sister's fiancé in her sister's bed, while her sister was lying paralyzed in a hospital. Terrence delivered the final blow. He told her the investors had immediately pulled all their funding and her company was completely dead. Maddie let out a gut-wrenching scream. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the pristine lawn, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The golden child was broken. She had lost her husband, her secret lover, her reputation, and her career in 5 minutes. Terrence stepped entirely around her sobbing form and walked over to stand right beside me, cementing our united front. The federal agents began aggressively marching Brenda across the lawn toward the front gates. Two officers held her tightly by the arms. Her designer heels dragged through the dirt. She looked absolutely feral. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled bird's nest around her face. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea to avoid touching her as she passed. The utter humiliation of being paraded in handcuffs through her own charity event was completely shattering her ego. But Brenda was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always bite. Just as the agents pulled her past the center stage, she dug the heels of her shoes into the grass, forcing them to stop for a brief second. She violently twisted her upper body around, locking her furious bloodshot eyes directly onto mine. She bared her teeth in a vicious snarl. She spat her words out like toxic venom, her voice echoing loudly for everyone to hear. She screamed at me, asking if I really thought I had won. She laughed a maniacal, breathless laugh. She yelled that I was a stupid, naive little girl. She screamed that she still legally owned the house I was living in. She declared at the top of her lungs that Derek had already transferred the $4 million from my encrypted USB drive straight into an untraceable offshore account early this morning. She promised me, screaming over the sirens pulling into the driveway, that she would use my own money to post her bail and completely ruin the rest of my miserable life. I listened to my mother scream her threats over the wailing sirens of the incoming police cruisers. She was completely unhinged, thrashing against the firm grip of the federal agents, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure spite. She genuinely believed she had beaten me. She thought she was the ultimate mastermind, holding all the financial cards, completely convinced that she had successfully stolen my life savings. I did not flinch. I did not back away. Instead, I let out a low, cold laugh. It was a calculated, hollow sound that completely cut through the chaotic noise of the backyard. My laughter echoed across the patio, chilling the remaining guests into absolute silence. I stepped right up to my mother. I stood so close I could see the frantic, desperate twitching of her eye and the sweat ruining her expensive foundation. I looked down at her, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm and steady tone. I asked her if she seriously thought I was that stupid. I reminded her that I am a professional forensic accountant. I track digital ghosts for a living. I look at complex corporate fraud all day long. I tilted my head and asked her, "Did you really think I kept $4 million of liquid assets on a cheap piece of promotional plastic I left taped behind a bathroom mirror?" Brenda stopped thrashing. The wild, triumphant gleam in her eyes flickered and died instantly, replaced by a sudden creeping terror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I did not give her a second to breathe. I walked her through her absolute failure step by step, making sure every single person in the crowd could hear exactly how pathetic her criminal enterprise truly was. I explained that the USB drive Derek so proudly stole in the middle of the night was nothing more than a digital honeypot. It was a custom-coded trap designed to look exactly like a high-yield cryptocurrency wallet. I told her there was absolutely no money on that drive. What it actually contained was a highly aggressive Trojan virus and a tracking script directly linked to a federal cybersecurity database. I pointed across the yard at Derek, who was still pinned to the ground, covered in smashed caviar and shattered glass. I raised my voice so he could hear me too. I explained that the moment Derek plugged that drive into Maddie's computer and hit the transfer button, he did not move $4 million. Instead, he blindly triggered a massive automated federal fraud alert. I told my mother that the system recorded Derek attempting to wire phantom funds across state lines directly into Maddie's corporate business account. By doing so, he did not just commit a minor theft. He explicitly triggered federal wire fraud statutes, which carry mandatory minimum prison sentences. Maddie let out another agonizing wail from the grass behind me, finally understanding that her beloved tech startup was not just bankrupt, it was now the center of a massive federal criminal investigation. I looked back at Brenda, whose face had gone completely slack. I smiled a razor-sharp smile. I told her that the federal government does not take kindly to massive wire fraud attempts. Because her name was listed as a secondary beneficiary on Maddie's fraudulent accounts, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit acted immediately. I leaned in closer, my voice an icy whisper. I informed her that at exactly 6 o'clock this morning, the federal government placed a total, uncompromising freeze on every single asset connected to her Social Security number. Her platinum credit cards, her offshore holding accounts, her retirement funds, and her secret safety deposit boxes were completely locked down. I told her she was completely broke. I told her she did not even have enough accessible cash to buy a cup of coffee, let alone post $1 million bail. Brenda shook her head violently, her tangled hair flying around her face. She refused to accept reality. She stammered, spitting her words out in a desperate, panicked frenzy. She yelled that it did not matter. She claimed she still had immense equity. She looked wildly around the lavish backyard at the massive white tent, the stone patio, and the sprawling brick mansion behind us. She screamed that this was her house, her property, and she would simply sell the estate to pay for the best defense lawyers in the state of Illinois. I let out another sharp, amused laugh. I slowly shook my head, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. I took a deliberate step back and gestured grandly toward the beautiful brick exterior of the mansion. I asked her how she planned to sell a property she no longer owned. Brenda froze completely. The federal agents holding her arms stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of her ego. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of cathartic victory wash over my entire body. I spoke slowly, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical blow. I told her that for the past year, I was the one secretly paying the massive mortgage on this house. When she tried to have me killed, those payments stopped. I told her she had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. She thought she could easily stall the bank by filing fraudulent medical extensions using my name, but she was completely unaware that I had already intercepted those documents and notified the bank of the fraud. I crossed my arms and delivered the final devastating checkmate. I told her that the bank officially foreclosed on the property yesterday morning. The estate was immediately seized and placed into a rapid closed-door private auction. I watched the last remaining drop of color completely drain from her face. I leaned in and whispered the final truth. I told her an anonymous limited liability company purchased the entire estate in cash less than 12 hours ago. I locked eyes with my mother, my smile widening into a triumphant grin. I asked her care to guess who owns the LLC. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, as the horrific reality of my words finally penetrated her thick skull. She did not need me to say my own name aloud. The answer was already written across my face. I had legally purchased my own childhood home right out from under her feet for pennies on the dollar. The mansion she had used for decades to project an image of old money and untouchable status no longer belonged to her. She was standing on my grass. She was trespassing on my property. She was entirely at my mercy, and I had absolutely none left to give. The crushing weight of her immediate future began to physically crush her. She was a 60-year-old woman who had never worked an honest day in her life, suddenly facing the absolute certainty of decades in a federal penitentiary. Her offshore accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were declined. She had no house to return to, no bed to sleep in, and no money to hire the ruthless defense attorneys she so desperately needed. The elegant aristocratic facade she had meticulously maintained for her country club friends completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brenda's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the manicured lawn, her expensive designer dress crumpling beneath her. She fell right into the dirt, ignoring the federal agents who still held a firm grip on her arms. She looked up at me from the ground, her perfectly applied makeup running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. The vicious, snarling predator from just a few moments ago was gone. In its place was a pathetic, terrified woman resorting to the only manipulation tactic she had left. She began to weep loudly, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. She begged me to call off the federal agents. She sobbed, claiming that the audio recordings must have been taken out of context. She leaned forward, straining against the handcuffs, and played her ultimate trump card. She cried out my name, her voice echoing with desperate, sickening sweetness. She told me that I could not do this to her because she was my mother. She reminded me that she gave me life, that she raised me, and that family must always stick together through difficult times. She practically howled, begging me to remember the bond of blood between us. She asked me to look into my heart and find the forgiveness that a daughter owes the woman who brought her into this world. I stood completely still, looking down at the woman kneeling in the dirt at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. My heart did not ache for her. The maternal bond she was desperately trying to weaponize had never actually existed. To her, I had only ever been an automated teller machine, a stepping stone, and eventually, a loose end that needed to be permanently tied up. I looked at her tear-streaked face and felt nothing but absolute freezing indifference. I stepped closer, ensuring she could hear every single syllable of my response over the wailing sirens. I looked her dead in the eye and told her she lost the right to call herself my mother the exact moment she told Derek to pull my plug. I told her a real mother would have sat by my hospital bed and held my hand. A real mother would have prayed for me to wake up. But she just looked at my paralyzed body and saw a delayed paycheck. I told her that she was nothing to me now, but a convicted felon trespassing on my lawn. I turned my back on her and gave the lead FBI agent a firm dismissive nod. That was the signal. The lead agent hauled Brenda forcefully to her feet. She kicked and screamed, thrashing wildly like a feral animal, completely abandoning whatever shred of dignity she had left. But the federal agents were entirely unbothered by her tantrums. They began dragging her across the patio toward the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked in my driveway. Maddie, who had been sobbing quietly on the grass, suddenly realized the nightmare was not restricted to just her mother and her secret lover. A female police officer approached her holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Maddie scrambled backward like a terrified crab, screaming that she had done nothing wrong, that she was just the innocent sister. The officer calmly grabbed Maddie by the wrist, hauling her up, and informing her that she was being placed under arrest for acting as a direct accessory to federal wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. The officer stated that receiving stolen funds across state lines made her equally culpable in the eyes of the law. The cold steel snapped shut around Maddie's wrists. Her screams of protest turned into breathless, hyperventilating shrieks as the reality of her ruined life finally set in. Meanwhile, two burly Chicago police officers hauled Derek up from the wreckage of the catering table. He was a spectacular, pathetic mess. His tailored suit was torn and soaked in expensive champagne. Shards of crystal and dollops of expensive black caviar clung to his hair and face. He was openly sobbing, a stream of snot and tears running down his chin, whining that he was manipulated into doing it and that Brenda forced him to cut the brakes. The officers ignored his pathetic sniveling, forcefully marching him across the lawn, right behind my screaming mother and my hysterical sister. The perp walk was the grand finale of the charity brunch. Over 100 of Brenda's closest, wealthiest high society friends stood completely paralyzed watching the spectacle unfold. These were the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Now they were standing on the grass with their jaws dropped, holding their smartphones up to record every humiliating second of her downfall. I watched the wealthy women whispering frantically behind their hands, their eyes wide with horrified fascination. They were already composing the vicious gossip they would spread at the country club tomorrow morning. My family was paraded right through the center of the crowd. Brenda tried to hide her face behind her tangled hair, but it was useless. The flash of smartphone cameras illuminated her tear-stained, dirt-streaked face. Derek tripped over his own ruined shoes, earning a harsh shove from the arresting officer. Maddie sobbed uncontrollably, begging the socialites to help her, but they simply recoiled from her like she was carrying a highly contagious disease. They were dragged out the front gates, shoved into the backs of 3 separate police cruisers, and locked inside the steel cages. I stood on my stone patio, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh afternoon air, watching the flashing police lights reflect off the brick exterior of my newly acquired home. The cancer had finally been completely excised from my life. 2 hours later, the warm afternoon sun of my backyard was replaced by the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the downtown Chicago police precinct. Terrence and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating darkness of a covert observation room. The heavy glass of the two-way mirror was cold against my fingertips as I looked through it into interrogation room number 4. We did not legally need to be here. The federal agents and local homicide detectives already possessed more than enough physical and digital evidence to lock all 3 of them away for the rest of their natural lives. But Terrence had pulled a few massive favors with the district attorney to grant us full access to the observation deck. As a forensic accountant, I am used to tracking missing assets and exposing fraudulent ledgers. But standing in this dark room, I was auditing something much more profound. I was auditing their souls, and the balance sheet was completely bankrupt. I did not just want to see them arrested, I wanted to watch them break. I wanted to witness exactly how fast their toxic, manipulative loyalty would dissolve when faced with actual, inescapable consequences. In the interrogation room, Derek was an incredibly pathetic sight. The arresting officers had confiscated his ruined suit jacket, his expensive silk tie, and his shoelaces, leaving him sitting in a stained, wrinkled dress shirt. He was hunched entirely over the cold metal table, his head buried deep in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. 2 seasoned homicide detectives sat across from him, looking at him with absolute, unrestrained disgust. They had not even offered him a plastic cup of water. The lead detective simply tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table. He opened it, revealing the printed screenshots of Derek's text messages with my mother and the high-definition still frames from his recovered dashcam footage. The detective tapped the glossy photographs with his pen and informed Derek that he was currently looking at a mandatory minimum of 25 years in a maximum security facility for attempted murder and federal wire fraud. Derek did not even try to invoke his right to an attorney. The exact moment the detective mentioned the 25-year prison sentence, Derek completely shattered into a million pieces. He threw his head back and began to wail like a terrified child. He pointed a violently trembling finger at the concrete wall, explicitly stating that he did not act alone. He practically screamed that the entire plan was Brenda's idea from the very beginning. He frantically offered to sign a full written confession, immediately swearing under oath that Brenda masterminded the entire assassination plot. He cried that she had heavily manipulated him, threatening to cut off his secret funding and ruin his relationship with me if he did not agree to tamper with my car brakes. He begged the detectives for a plea deal, desperately trying to trade my mother's freedom for a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. Watching him effortlessly sell out the woman who had practically adopted him was incredibly satisfying. There was absolutely no honor among thieves. Terrence let out a low, mocking whistle, crossing his arms tightly over his broad chest. He pressed a silver button on the audio console mounted to the wall, switching our live monitoring feed to interrogation room number 7, located just down the long hallway. We looked through the secondary security monitor to watch my mother. Brenda was taking a completely different tactical approach. She was sitting perfectly upright in her uncomfortable metal chair, her hands folded neatly on the table, trying desperately to maintain her fading aristocratic posture. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, and her hair was a tangled mess, but her signature arrogance remained completely intact. A senior federal agent was aggressively questioning her about the forged charity documents, the fraudulent medical proxy, and the attempted wire transfer. Brenda did not shed a single tear. She looked at the federal agent with an expression of highly manufactured victimhood and lied straight through her teeth. Brenda claimed that she was completely innocent and utterly confused by the entire terrifying situation. Then, without a single second of hesitation or maternal guilt, she threw her golden child directly under the speeding bus. Brenda stated clearly for the audio recording that she was just a grieving, emotionally overwhelmed mother who had blindly trusted her daughters to handle the complex family finances. She explicitly blamed Maddie for the massive wire fraud attempt. Brenda told the federal agent that Maddie was the one failing miserably in business, and that Maddie had secretly forged those charity documents to illegally funnel money into her bankrupt tech startup. She claimed Maddie had manipulated her into signing legal papers she did not understand. She even tried to argue that Maddie and Derek had conspired together to steal my money so they could run away and start a new life, painting herself as the tragic elderly victim of their deceit. Brenda was entirely willing to send her youngest favorite daughter to federal prison for decades just to save her own skin. What Brenda did not know was the architectural layout of the downtown precinct. The Chicago Police Department had placed Maddie in a temporary holding cell located directly adjacent to interrogation room number 7. The walls were thick, poured concrete, but the old industrial air conditioning vents connected the two rooms perfectly. Terrence had specifically requested that strategic placement when he spoke to the district attorney. Maddie was sitting on a hard steel bench in her holding cell, shivering violently in her torn designer dress. Through the metal grate of the ventilation shaft right above her head, she heard every single word her mother said. She heard the woman who had pampered her, spoiled her, and elevated her above me for her entire life completely destroy her. She heard Brenda volunteer her name to the federal agents, shifting the entire weight of a massive criminal conspiracy squarely onto her shoulders. The horrific realization hit Maddie like a physical blow to the chest. The golden child finally understood the darkest, most twisted truth of our family dynamic. She was never truly loved. She was never actually cherished. She was only ever a highly convenient tool, an extension of Brenda's massive ego, and the perfect scapegoat the moment things went wrong. Maddie let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, curling into a tight ball on the cold floor of the holding cell. The toxic family unit was not just broken. It was actively and viciously cannibalizing itself, tearing each other apart piece by piece in a desperate bid for survival, and I had a front row seat to the absolute carnage. The criminal justice system moves slowly, but the civil courts move exactly as fast as a highly motivated corporate lawyer wants them to. Over the next 3 weeks, Terrence and I unleashed an absolute barrage of civil litigation that systematically dismantled whatever pathetic scraps remained of my family's estate. While Brenda and Derek sat in federal holding cells awaiting their criminal trials, Maddie was forced to face Terrence in family court. She walked into the deposition room looking like a ghost. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap wrinkled blouse. She had hired a bargain bin public defender because her bank accounts were still completely frozen by the FBI. Terrence sat across from her, radiating cold professional lethality. Maddie actually tried to demand spousal support. She cried to the judge, claiming she had sacrificed her prime years to support Terrence's legal career and deserved half of his multi-million-dollar net worth. Terrence did not even raise his voice. He simply opened his briefcase and submitted the forensic financial audit I had prepared for him. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Maddie had systematically embezzled marital funds to finance her illicit affair with Derek and her fraudulent startup. The judge was completely appalled by her audacity. The ruling was swift and entirely merciless. Terrence legally eviscerated her. The judge enforced their ironclad prenuptial agreement to the letter, awarding Terrence 100% of his premarital assets, full ownership of their downtown penthouse, and every single penny of his investment portfolios. Maddie was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, insurmountable legal debt from her failed company and the impending legal fees for her federal wire fraud defense. Terrence walked out of that courtroom a completely free and wealthy man, not even glancing back as Maddie collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. With Maddie entirely neutralized and Brenda locked away, it was time to finalize the complete acquisition of my childhood trauma. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I drove my restored sports car up the winding driveway of the massive brick mansion I now legally owned. I was not alone. I had hired a premium private moving company and a local county sheriff to enforce the final eviction notice. Brenda had always treated this house like a sacred museum dedicated to her own manufactured aristocratic glory. Every single room was stuffed with ridiculously expensive, pretentious furniture she could never actually afford. I stood on the front porch, unlocked the heavy mahogany door with my brand new keys, and stepped aside. I gave the foreman a simple, crystal clear instruction. I told him to clear out every single piece of furniture, every tacky oil painting, and every hideous crystal vase, and dump it all straight onto the front curb for the municipal trash collection. For the next 4 hours, I stood on the pristine front lawn with a cup of hot coffee, watching the spectacular dismantling of Brenda's fake empire. The movers hauled out her absurdly expensive crushed velvet sofas, tossing them unceremoniously onto the dead grass. They carried out the massive oak dining table where she had tried to force me to sign away my rights. They dragged her heavy, ridiculously ornate canopy bed out the front doors and dismantled it with power drills. Neighbors driving past in their luxury SUVs slowed down, staring in absolute shock as the neighborhood's most arrogant resident had her entire life tossed into a massive dumpster. I watched a priceless antique mirror shatter against the pavement, feeling a deep, incredibly satisfying sense of closure. The physical representation of my mother's suffocating ego was literally being reduced to garbage. By late afternoon, the massive house was almost entirely empty. The cavernous rooms echoed with my footsteps, stripped bare of all the toxic memories. I decided to do a final sweep of the property to ensure nothing was left behind. I pulled down the creaky wooden stairs leading up to the dark, dusty attic. The air up there was stale and smelled of old cardboard and dry rot. The movers had already cleared out Brenda's seasonal decorations, leaving only a few small, neglected boxes pushed deep into the darkest corner near the insulation. I turned on my phone flashlight and walked over to investigate. The boxes were covered in a thick layer of dust. I knelt down and wiped away the grime from the top flap of the first box. My own name was written on the cardboard in faded black marker. I opened it carefully, coughing slightly, as a cloud of dust billowed upward. Inside were my old childhood journals, my middle school spelling bee trophies, and a stack of faded photo albums. It was the only box of my personal belongings Brenda had bothered to keep shoved into the dark, where she would never have to look at it. But tucked underneath my diary from the 5th grade was a thick, rubber-banded stack of envelopes from a major national bank. The envelopes were unopened and deeply yellowed with age. I snapped the rubber band and tore open the top envelope. It was a credit card statement. The card was issued in my name, but the date on the statement was from exactly 17 years ago. I was only 10 years old at the time. I quickly tore open the rest of the envelopes. My hands began to shake, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming, furious clarity. Brenda had stolen my social security number when I was just a child. She had opened multiple secret credit lines in my name, maxed them out on luxury vacations and expensive clothes, and then let them default, completely ruining my credit score before I was even old enough to drive. Every single financial struggle I faced in my early 20s, every loan I was denied, every apartment application I had to fight for, was not bad luck. It was her. She had been financially bleeding me dry since I was a little girl. If any tiny, lingering shred of daughterly guilt still existed in my heart, that dusty box completely annihilated it. It solidified the ultimate truth that absolutely no mercy was warranted, and I was going to make sure the judge knew exactly what she had done. 6 months later, I walked through the heavy double doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The crisp autumn air outside was a sharp contrast to the suffocating stale tension inside the courtroom. Terrence walked right beside me, wearing a flawless charcoal suit, carrying his leather briefcase with the quiet authority he always possessed. We took our seats in the front row of the gallery, right behind the prosecutor table. The massive wood-paneled room was intimidating, designed to make every single person standing before the judge feel incredibly small. But for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel small. I felt like a titan. The heavy wooden door near the jury box opened. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Derek into the room. He was wearing an oversized, faded orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The handsome, charming fiancé who used to obsess over his tailored suits and expensive watches was completely gone. His hair was thinning, his posture was violently hunched, and his skin had a sickly pale pallor. He shuffled to the defense table and collapsed into his chair, not even daring to look in my direction. A moment later, my mother was brought out through the same door. Seeing Brenda in federal custody was a profound shock to the system. The woman who had spent decades meticulously crafting an image of wealthy, untouchable superiority looked completely ravaged by 6 months in a county holding facility. Her perfectly dyed hair had grown out, revealing harsh, wiry gray roots. Her expensive skincare routine was replaced by deep, haggard lines of stress and sheer terror. She looked incredibly frail, her hands shaking violently as the marshals forced her to sit next to her public defender. The golden child Maddie was not in the courtroom. She was too busy working a grueling minimum wage shift to pay off her own massive legal restitution, completely abandoning the mother who had ruined her life. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and the entire courtroom stood in unison. The judge was a stern, no-nonsense man in his late 50s, with a reputation for handing down maximum sentences in federal fraud cases. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the massive stack of case files sitting on his bench. He addressed the court, summarizing the overwhelming mountain of evidence the federal prosecutors had compiled. The dashcam footage, the recovered audio recordings, the fraudulent medical proxy, and the financial honeypot had made a prolonged trial completely unnecessary. Both Derek and Brenda had taken plea deals to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars. But today was the official sentencing, and I had a vital role to play before the gavel dropped. The prosecutor stood up and informed the judge that the victim wished to make a formal impact statement. The judge nodded and gestured toward the witness stand. I stood up from my seat, smoothing out the skirt of my sharp-tailored navy suit. I walked past the defense table, ignoring the pathetic whimpers coming from Derek and the frantic, desperate stare burning into the side of my head from my mother. I stepped into the witness box and adjusted the microphone. I looked out at the massive courtroom, feeling the weight of the moment settle over my shoulders. I did not shed a single tear. My voice did not shake. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of a woman who had meticulously audited her own trauma and closed the ledger permanently. I told the court that I was not there to ask for pity. I told them that the people sitting at the defense table did not view me as a daughter or a fiancée. They viewed me as a highly profitable asset to be liquidated. I explained how my mother had stolen my social security number when I was 10 years old, ruining my financial future before I even understood what money was. I detailed the years of emotional manipulation, the relentless gaslighting, and the suffocating pressure to financially support a family that actively resented my independence. I told the judge about the sheer horror of waking up paralyzed in a hospital bed, entirely trapped in my own body, listening to the two people I trusted most calculate the exact expiration time of my life insurance policy. I looked directly at Derek. I told him he was a coward who traded his soul for a payout he was too stupid to successfully secure. Derek dropped his head onto the table, sobbing loudly into his chained hands. Then I turned my gaze entirely to my mother. She flinched under my stare. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring my voice echoed through every corner of the massive room. I told her that she spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, incompetent, and utterly dependent on her approval. I said she thought she could easily erase me from the world and steal the empire I built with my own 2 hands. I delivered the final, chilling truth. I said they tried to bury me. They did not realize I was a forensic auditor. I thrive in the dirt. I know exactly how to dig up every single secret you ever tried to hide. You wanted my money, but all you earned was a cage. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the federal marshals were staring at me with deep, quiet respect. I stepped down from the witness stand, my heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, and walked back to my seat next to Terrence. He gave me a single approving nod. The judge took a long, heavy breath, looking down at the two broken criminals sitting before him. He spoke directly into his microphone. He stated that in his 30 years on the federal bench, he had rarely seen a case of such profound, calculated cruelty and overwhelming greed. He turned to me and officially commended my extraordinary bravery, my brilliant tactical restraint, and my incredible resilience in the face of absolute evil. Then he turned his wrath upon the defense table. He ordered Derek to stand. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted manslaughter and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Derek wailed, his legs giving out completely as the marshals had to physically hold him upright. The judge then ordered Brenda to rise. She stood on shaking legs, her eyes wide with animalistic terror. The judge looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He sentenced her to 20 consecutive years in a maximum security federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, massive insurance fraud, and federal identity theft. She would be 80 years old before she even saw a parole board. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a massive booming crack that echoed like thunder. He declared the court adjourned. The sound of that gavel dropping was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of my absolute freedom sealing their miserable fates forever. While Derek and my mother were immediately transported to federal processing facilities to begin their decades-long sentences, my sister Maddie managed to secure a slightly different kind of prison. She was absolutely terrified of spending even a single night in a real jail cell. To save herself, she completely abandoned her family loyalty and eagerly took a brutal plea deal from the federal prosecutors. She testified extensively against Brenda and Derek, handing over every single password, email thread, and text message she could find to ensure they received the maximum possible sentences. In exchange for her complete cooperation, the judge allowed her to avoid actual prison time, but she did not walk away free. The federal court placed her on 5 years of highly restrictive probation and saddled her with a mandatory, non-dischargeable federal restitution debt of exactly $500,000. Because the debt was tied to a federal fraud conviction, she could not file for bankruptcy to escape it. Her tech startup was officially dissolved by the state, her conservative investors publicly blacklisted her name, and her entire network of wealthy friends completely abandoned her. She was legally required to secure immediate, verifiable employment to begin garnishing her wages for the court, which left her with extremely limited options for someone with a ruined reputation and a massive fraud conviction on her public record. A few weeks after the sentencing hearing, I found myself driving through the quiet, rain-slicked streets of the Chicago suburbs late at night. I was behind the wheel of my fully restored sports car, the exact same vehicle Derek had tried to use as my metal coffin. The engine purred smoothly, a constant reminder of my survival and my absolute victory. It was past 2 in the morning, and I had just finished a highly lucrative freelance audit for a major logistics company. I was exhausted, but running on a quiet, peaceful adrenaline. The cold autumn rain was lightly tapping against my windshield, and I decided I needed a strong cup of black coffee before making the long drive back to my newly renovated brick mansion. I pulled off the main highway and steered my car toward the brightly lit neon signs of a massive, notoriously cheap fast food chain. The parking lot was completely empty, except for a single rusty sedan parked near the dumpsters. I pulled into the narrow drive-through lane, rolling my window down slightly to let the cool night air in. The glowing menu board illuminated the dark pavement. I pressed the intercom button and ordered a large black coffee. The voice that crackled back through the cheap outdoor speaker was completely flat, exhausted, and entirely devoid of any life. It told me to pull forward to the second window to pay. I slowly eased my foot off the brake and let the car glide forward toward the brightly lit pickup window. The harsh fluorescent lights from inside the restaurant spilled out into the dark, rainy night. I reached into my designer handbag resting on the passenger seat and pulled out my leather wallet. I retrieved a crisp, newly printed $100 bill. As I pulled up to the glass window, it slid open automatically. I looked up, ready to hand the cash to the cashier. The breath instantly caught in my throat. Standing on the other side of the sliding glass window was my sister Maddie. The former golden child, the woman who used to mock my wardrobe and demand full-time housekeeping staff for my house, was currently wearing an oversized, brightly colored polyester uniform that was heavily stained with fryer grease. Her perfect blonde hair was tied back in a messy, careless ponytail, covered by a cheap plastic visor. Dark bags hung heavily under her eyes, and her skin looked pale and completely exhausted. She reached her hand out automatically to take my payment, not even bothering to look at my face. I held the crisp $100 bill just out of her reach. The slight hesitation made her finally look up. Her eyes met mine. I watched the physical shock ripple completely through her entire body. Her hand froze in midair. Her jaw went slack. The sheer humiliation of being caught working the graveyard shift at a fast food drive-through by the sister she had actively conspired to destroy was completely agonizing. She looked at my pristine sports car, my tailored suit, and then down at the crisp bill in my hand. She opened her mouth perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, or perhaps to hurl an insult. But I did not give her the chance to say a single syllable. I pushed the $100 bill directly into her trembling fingers. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression perfectly neutral, and delivered the ultimate devastating power move. I told her to keep the change. I did not wait for a receipt. I did not wait for my coffee. I simply rolled my window up, took my foot off the brake, and drove smoothly out of the parking lot, leaving her standing under the harsh fluorescent lights holding my money. The profound sense of closure was absolutely intoxicating. I merged back onto the empty highway, the tires humming perfectly against the wet asphalt. I had finally severed the absolute last string tying me to my toxic past. Maddie would spend the next decade flipping burgers to pay off her massive fraud debt, while Brenda and Derek rotted in their concrete cells. As I accelerated toward the city skyline, the Bluetooth system integrated into my car dashboard suddenly chimed loudly, indicating an incoming phone call. It was incredibly late for a professional call, but the caller ID displayed the name of one of the largest, most prestigious corporate financial law firms in downtown Chicago. I pressed the button on my steering wheel to accept the call. A deep, confident voice on the other end introduced himself as the senior managing partner of the firm. He did not waste any time with small talk. He told me that rumors of my brilliant, absolutely ruthless financial honeypot trap had circulated widely through the highest levels of the Chicago legal community. He said his firm was dealing with a massive influx of complex corporate embezzlement cases, and they desperately needed someone with my specific aggressive skill set. He told me he was officially offering me a full partnership position, complete with a corner office and an unprecedented starting salary, entirely based on the legendary takedown of my own family. I told the senior managing partner I would be in his office first thing Monday morning to discuss the specifics, but before I stepped into that boardroom to negotiate my new partnership, I had one extremely important stop to make. A week later, I walked through the towering glass doors of Terrence's high-end corporate law firm in the heart of downtown Chicago. The lobby was an expansive showcase of sleek marble modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the restless gray waters of Lake Michigan. The receptionist recognized me immediately, offering a warm, respectful smile before escorting me directly past the waiting area and down the long, quiet corridor of senior executive suites. I did not feel out of place among the bespoke suits and the quiet hum of immense corporate power. I felt like I had finally arrived exactly where I belonged. Terrence was standing behind his massive mahogany desk when I walked into his spacious corner office. He was wearing a flawless, tailored charcoal suit, looking out at the city skyline with a quiet, undeniable authority. When he heard the heavy wooden door click shut behind me, he turned around and a genuine broad smile broke across his handsome face. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a polished mahogany side table and poured 2 glasses of incredibly rare aged scotch. He handed one of the heavy crystal tumblers to me, holding his own glass high up in the air to propose a formal toast. He did not toast to revenge or to the spectacular destruction of the people who had callously tried to bury us. Instead, he toasted to the brilliant future standing right in front of us. He toasted to our newly formed professional alliance. We took a slow sip of the smoky complex liquor, letting the comfortable silence in the luxurious office speak volumes. Over the past few weeks, we had quietly begun laying the meticulous groundwork for a highly specialized elite financial legal consultancy firm. We were rapidly building an unstoppable platonic powerhouse duo that would absolutely dominate the Chicago corporate landscape. Terrence was the razor-sharp legal mind, highly capable of navigating the most complex corporate litigation and tearing apart fraudulent contracts with surgical precision. I was the relentless financial bloodhound, the forensic accountant who could easily track hidden offshore assets, decrypt heavily altered corporate ledgers, and find the stolen money no matter how deeply the criminals tried to bury it. Together, we were a walking nightmare for corrupt executives and a massive, invaluable asset for anyone needing absolute financial justice. We had already successfully secured 3 major corporate clients, based entirely on the fearsome reputation we built while completely dismantling Brenda and Derek. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling, bustling metropolis far below. The tiny cars moved like busy ants through the organized grid of the city streets. I took another long sip of my expensive scotch and looked back at Terrence, who was leaning casually against the edge of his massive desk. We started talking about the fundamental, often misunderstood concept of family. For 27 long years, I was heavily brainwashed into believing that blood automatically dictated unquestionable loyalty. I was constantly taught that sharing a genetic code meant I inherently owed my abusers an infinite supply of forgiveness money and personal sacrifice. Terrence understood that deeply toxic dynamic better than anyone else in the world, having barely survived the suffocating, highly manipulative marriage to my arrogant sister Maddie. He walked over and stood right beside me, looking out at the exact same breathtaking skyline. He looked at me and told me that blood means absolutely nothing if that blood is entirely poisoned. He said that biology is just a random, uncontrollable accident of birth, but true family is a deliberate, active, and daily choice. He firmly stated that a real family is built on a solid foundation of absolute mutual respect, unwavering trust, and a fierce loyalty that does not suddenly evaporate the moment you stop handing out free cash. Listening to him speak, I realized that Terrence was the protective, fiercely loyal older brother I never actually had. He stepped into my hospital room and willingly risked his entire prestigious legal career to aggressively protect a paralyzed woman he barely knew, simply because it was the morally right thing to do. He stood fearlessly between me and the vicious predators who wanted me dead, wielding the federal law like an impenetrable steel shield. I looked up at him, my eyes clear and completely dry, and told him that he was my true chosen family now. We had forged an unbreakable bond directly in the raging fires of ultimate betrayal, and it was infinitely stronger than any fragile genetic tie I ever shared with the miserable felons currently sitting in federal prison cells. Terrence smiled warmly, placing a heavy, incredibly reassuring hand on my right shoulder. He gave me an affirming nod, then walked back over to his desk and carefully opened a sleek black leather portfolio. He pulled out a single perfectly printed legal document and laid it completely flat on the polished mahogany surface. He placed a heavy silver fountain pen right next to it, perfectly parallel to the crisp white paper. It was not a binding contract for our new business venture, nor was it a retainer agreement for a new wealthy client. It was something profoundly more significant and deeply personal. He told me that if we were going to officially launch our new firm and take over the city, I needed to make absolutely sure my legal identity completely reflected the powerful, victorious woman I had finally become rather than the broken victim my mother tried to permanently create. I picked up the heavy silver pen and signed the name change petition. With one stroke, I legally severed the final tie to Brenda's toxic bloodline, ready to embrace my limitless new life. Leaving the law firm that afternoon felt like stepping into a completely different universe. The heavy, invisible chains I had dragged around for 27 years were finally gone, left behind in that sleek corporate office, along with the last remnants of my old name. I drove my sports car back to the suburbs, the setting sun casting a warm golden glow over the Chicago skyline in my rearview mirror. I pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates of my estate and parked in the circular driveway. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, simply staring at the massive brick exterior of the house. It was the exact same structure I had grown up in, but its entire soul had been radically transformed. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The oppressive museum-like atmosphere Brenda had cultivated for decades was completely eradicated. Over the past few months, I had hired a team of top-tier interior designers and contractors to rip out every single trace of her toxic presence. The dark, heavy velvet curtains that used to block out the sun were gone, replaced by massive custom-built windows that flooded the grand foyer with natural light. The gaudy crystal chandeliers had been dismantled and replaced with sleek modern fixtures. The walls, once covered in hideous floral wallpaper and pretentious oil paintings, were now painted a crisp, clean white, adorned with vibrant contemporary art that actually brought me joy. I took a deep breath. The house no longer smelled of my mother's overpowering, expensive perfume. It smelled like fresh paint, polished hardwood, and absolute freedom. I walked through the expansive living room, my heels echoing lightly on the wide plank oak floors. There was no more walking on eggshells. There was no more shrinking myself to fit into the suffocating mold of the scapegoat daughter. Every single piece of furniture, every rug, and every decorative accent had been chosen entirely by me, paid for with my own hard-earned money. This was no longer a fortress of fake aristocracy built on a foundation of stolen credit and lies. It was my sanctuary. It was the physical manifestation of my survival and my ultimate victory. I made my way up the grand staircase to the second floor and walked down the hall to the master suite. It was the largest room in the house, a room Brenda had selfishly claimed for herself while shoving me into a cramped guest room for most of my childhood. I had knocked down a wall to expand it even further, creating a massive sunlit home office that overlooked the sprawling backyard where the charity brunch disaster had taken place. I walked over to the sleek minimalist desk sitting in the center of the room and sank into the plush leather ergonomic chair. I opened my laptop and woke up the screen. The digital dashboard of my secure financial network automatically loaded. I spent a few quiet minutes looking at the numbers on the screen. My investment portfolios were thriving. The decoy accounts I had used to trap Derek were safely closed, and my actual assets were locked behind impenetrable multi-layered security protocols. Next to my laptop sat a small, elegant wooden box. I opened the lid and pulled out a fresh stack of premium heavy cardstock business cards. They featured the sleek modern logo of the new elite financial legal consultancy firm Terrence and I had just launched. But more importantly, the cards proudly displayed my brand new legal name. I traced my thumb over the embossed silver lettering. The woman who had been paralyzed in that hospital bed, terrified and completely at the mercy of predators, was gone forever. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the massive window at the rolling green lawn. The evening sky was turning a deep, peaceful shade of indigo. A profound sense of calm settled over my entire body. It was a kind of peace I had never experienced before. I thought about the sheer terror of waking up from that coma, unable to move a single muscle, listening to the man I loved and the mother who gave birth to me casually calculate my murder. I thought about the weeks of relentless psychological torture, the gaslighting, the fake smiles, and the suffocating desperation they used to try and strip away my sanity. They thought I was a weak, easily manipulated victim. They severely underestimated the unbreakable resilience of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to survive in the dark. They were currently sitting in cold, concrete federal prison cells, stripped of their designer clothes, their fake prestige, and their precious freedom. They would spend the next 2 decades staring at iron bars, completely forgotten by the high society friends they had fought so desperately to impress. Maddie was trapped in a greasy uniform, working the graveyard shift, drowning in $500,000 of federal restitution debt that she could never escape. They had completely cannibalized each other, destroying their own lives out of pure, unadulterated greed. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar estate, holding a lucrative corporate partnership, completely surrounded by a chosen family that genuinely respected and protected me. The universe has a brilliant way of balancing the scales provided you are willing to do the heavy lifting to expose the truth. I closed my laptop and let out a long, contented sigh. The war was officially over. The audit was complete. The accounts were finally balanced. If there is someone in your life making you feel crazy while they empty your pockets, stop doubting yourself. Set the trap, check the locks. And remember, the greatest revenge isn't just surviving, it's making them watch you thrive. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments, what was the moment you realized your toxic family member was the villain?